iconography and different symbols.
Sorry.
So the best thing I say sometimes as a marketer is to forget that you're a marketer and remember that you're just a person like everybody else. And people want the world around them to be reflected in the media that they see. So when it comes to putting out things like content and campaigns, it is super important to look at visuals and make sure that your visuals are reflective of the reality of society. And the reason that I believe representation is so important when it comes to visuals in marketing as a digital marketer is because visualizing diversity actually helps to normalize diversity. Inclusive imagery is something that has the power to shift perspectives. As consumers, all the images and the symbols that we see every day, they have the power to shape, to reinforce, and to even change our perceptions of not only the world around us, but ourselves as well. So when I do put that marketing hat back on, I'm reminded through data that audiences want from brands those things that are going to make them feel like society values them, to make them feel like, they're a member of the culture, essentially. There's stats that, show that more than 60% of people say that if there's a lack of diversity in a brand's materials, it actually challenges the way that they perceive their products and services. So it's a business risk, honestly, to not have representation in your imagery.
Yeah, that's so true, because there's a lot of research that show that diversity and inclusion is equal to improve business, so business performance, well-being in the company. So, and employees actually expect companies to do a lot more, which I hope they can listen. Yes. But so from the campaigns that you've seen in the past or even current ones, are there gaps? Do you see any gaps when it comes to representation of people of color? Like, do you see a lot of stereotypes coming and going, or what's your take on that?
Yes, unfortunately, I do. Things have improved very much so in the last few years. And obviously, with the past couple of years, there have been social movements and unfortunate situations that have actually caused a reckoning, quite honestly, within the creative space. And so, although there's been improvements, we do still see gaps when it comes to representations of people of color. And quite honestly, I believe that comes down to most times who's in the workroom where creative strategies are built, right? I can't speak for the US, but in Canada specifically, and I'm sure it's very similar in the US, but we don't see very many, let's say, melanated people in executive positions at creative agencies. The vast majority of people who are, persons of color in creative spaces are at the early stages of their career, and they're actually lacking a lot of the mentorship and sponsorship that they need at work to excel in their careers. So people of color who work in marketing and advertising largely feel disempowered a lot of the times, or disillusioned by the state of their organizations and the commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion, which results in a limitation to their ability to contribute creatively and actually challenge what we see in traditional or conventional media based off their lived experiences as non-white people. So I think there's still a lot of progress to be made, despite the fact that we see a lot more diversity now. But right now, the big challenge is that people will sometimes tokenize imagery or people to kind of check that box and be seen as progressive, versus actually taking a look at their internal policies and structures and practices to say, well, our commitment and values as an organization, our brand and our identity as an organization is one that values all people, and therefore what we put out into the world is naturally going to reflect the society we live in. Right now, we kind of just still see a lot of times throwing an image into something that doesn't always make sense, or doing it to kind of check the box and remain compliant with certain things.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. What would you advise? So let's say let's do like a quick case study. Like, what if I am so I work in a company on the creative team, and I am looking for images. What type of stereotype, for example, I should avoid when I know that I should try to reflect as many people as possible in their natural environment without having any stereotypes? Like, how can one achieve that? So let's say I'm not Native American and I'm looking for, I'm trying to include Native American in our messaging and our visuals. So if I go to a platform and I start typing keywords, like would I just type Native American? Would it be enough? Do I have to do some type of reading? Maybe try to talk to some Native American if I can find them. What would be your approach to do that type of work if you're not really close to diverse people, for example?
Yeah, I love that question, because the last part you mentioned, I think, is really important. If your circle isn't diverse and you're not exposing yourself, or you're not being exposed to different cultures regularly in your life, it is going to be harder for you to approach something like inclusive marketing in an authentic way, because you don't have the experience and it's harder. And sometimes people even feel a little bit, I want to say, afraid to try and broach that. But, if you were, the example you gave of trying to represent Indigenous peoples in your creative, well, I think the very first thing that you need to think about when you're thinking of, or when you're considering including images of different communities, is what is your audience and why are you doing it? I think the motivation is what matters the most. I know you particularly wouldn't try to tokenize anybody or just try to put something in to check the box like we mentioned earlier, but knowing why you're including certain imagery into your creative, your content, your campaigns is pretty paramount to going and searching for those materials. Motivation, like I said, matters most. And the unfortunate reality is that going into the tactics of it, when you search for images like Native American through typical stock photo sites, you're not going to see people necessarily just living their lives, simply existing. And that's really what people want to see. People are looking for realness in the images that they consume nowadays. But what you're going to find with Indigenous stock photos in particular is that they're going to showcase typically one of two things. They're going to show people in their traditional regalia, or they're going to show people protesting. But Indigenous peoples, we are much more than a spectacle to be observed, and we don't live our day-to-day lives in powwow outfits. We wear suit and ties, we wear jeans and sneakers in everyday life. And we're also way more than, the issues and crises that affect our communities as well. But the rare time that you do see images of Indigenous people in media, it's usually a protest or something quite negative. So when you search for those images, be conscious of that fact. Be conscious of the fact that there is a lot of bias still at play in how stock photography sites work, and the contributors to stock photography don't always have that multicultural lens when they're going through and capturing images. And like I said, those are the two situations typically that you're going to find stock photos of when you're looking for Indigenous peoples. So it is helpful to kind of enhance your keyword searching for sure. But even there, keywords on stock photography sites are often based on the photographers as well, right? So photographers are responsible for labeling their images, and things can get mislabeled. Sometimes the way things are labeled can cause some sensitivities in certain situations. So my advice for anyone who's looking to include diverse communities in your advertising or your marketing when searching stock photography sites is to just be aware of the bias that exists, the bias that exists perhaps on your end as someone who has not been exposed to diverse communities or who even has been. We all have biases, so it's good to be aware of them.
Yeah.
And then be aware of the bias of the people producing those photos. So that way you're examining the photos with a critical lens to know what they truly are representing and what the intention behind the image was. And also be aware of the stock photo site's algorithm bias.
Yeah.
You know, the most popular image isn't always the right image. So, you know, search, it's gonna take longer, but you have to put the work in to search harder for real authentic imagery. Yeah.
Yeah, I think everything you said is right. And it made me actually think about the role of movies in the perception and bias that have built up in our head. It's true when you talked about indigenous communities, it's true that, you know, growing up, the movies that were portraying them in one way only. So when you think about Native Americans, you just like, you always get reminded of that movie that you watched when you were like maybe 5 years old. But you have to deconstruct it. Like talking about it, like you just mentioned, will make you realize that, whoa, okay, actually, yeah, as you said, like, you know, they could wear sneakers, they could be like anybody. There's also so much multiculturalism in those communities that, you know, it's not that person that you saw in the movie like 30 years ago. They could come and look in so many ways. So we have to be prepared with that also, that what we think is the best representation is not always the representation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
For sure. I mean, look at me. I'm an Indigenous person. Am I the stereotypical image of an Indigenous person? Probably not. You know, people don't picture me when they think of Indigenous, and I am I guess biracial person, but I am equally Indigenous as I am Black. And that's the other thing too. And maybe to add on to how things you should consider is the fact that multiple, you know, people have multiple aspects of their identity. So you can't just kind of check, you don't just fit into one box. And when you're trying to authentically represent the audiences you're trying to serve, you have to be mindful that not everybody fits in a single box either. And, you know, you're not going to be able to just represent someone's the full scope of someone's identity through a single image ever.
That's true. And do you think companies or advertisers should always include a person of color or somebody from a minority community when they try to, you know, create advertising or any communications for companies? Does it have to be systematic? Does it have to be always, when you see a photo of, let's say, a company, that you always have to have like a representation of any community?
So I think some people would get uncomfortable if anyone answered yes to that question, but here's diversity exists every day and in every way. So I don't see why not. If there is some discomfort with that, or it's been difficult for people to showcase diversity in their materials, I would have to ask them why that is. Why are they hesitant about adding more diversity into their campaigns? Why hasn't there been diversity in the past? Those are, I think, the questions that need to be asked in those situations, rather than trying to force fit something. At the end of the day, I think that, you know, really purpose-driven brands, or brands that have the values to represent people and to serve individuals, regardless of their identity markers, will naturally showcase diversity. Quite honestly, that's what's going to happen, especially if you have people in your team who represent diverse communities. You know, I don't think that anyone especially those of us who fall into that diversity bucket, are looking to be tokenized through imagery.
Yes.
And that's, I think, the trap that people can fall into if they just are trying to put images of Black people or persons of color into something every time just because they want to be seen as a diverse organization,
Yeah.
or they're trying to pander to certain communities. We're going to see through that tokenization immediately. We want, like I said before, realness when it comes to seeing images of our communities in media, right?
Yeah, that's true. And I think it comes back to what you said earlier about identifying why you're doing it. Because the last thing you want is to lie to your stakeholder, like people who, follow you. And like that post that I saw on LinkedIn where people complain about some companies actually using Black people as token. So you have to be real in why you're doing it. Is your company's values really include, does really your company value include really inclusion? So it has to be real. Whatever you do has to be really representative of who you are as a brand or as a company or as whatever. But it's true. Like I think we talked about it last time we chatted. I was telling you about, I worked with a company and I was very impressed with the way they were handling choosing diverse content, diverse visuals. They talked to pretty much all the stakeholders in the company. They talked to DNI. They talked to other affinity groups, even the one that were not part of the, because I have Afrocentric people. So they even talked to other affinity groups within the company. They talked to legal. And I was very impressed. I was like, wow, okay. So, and you could tell also by the choice of images they were getting. I was very proud. I was like, wow, this is really diverse. Like even within Black communities, like we tend to see women always used with an afro, which is not always representative of the whole community. I feel like if you use one day a woman with an afro, you should get another day a woman with a wig or like with straight hair, or or with dreadlocks, or because we have so many different hairstyle, that if you think that a Black woman is a woman with an afro and you think that you're very avant-gardist and really open, and you think that you're going to attract, and people are going to think that you're doing a great job, Black people are going to see it. So they're going to be like, okay, here is the token again. This is not real. I don't want to be part of it. They're not taking risks. They don't know what they're doing. They're not asking questions. And it's pretty sad. So yeah, so definitely talk to as many people as possible and make sure that you get comment and feedback from all of that. I want to talk about something that's not funny, but I mean, because in our communities, we've seen it so many times. Now, sometimes it's funny. What are the most stereotypes that you've seen, for example, when people try to represent Black people? The common stereotypes in visual.
Yeah. To be, underrepresentation in media is sometimes covert, and then sometimes it's overt. And what I mean by covert is that there's subtlety sometimes in the way Black people are portrayed. So even something as simple, you mentioned hair, like sometimes underrepresentation can come from thinking Black people have a certain hair type and not even understanding how important hair is and how much of a cultural phenomenon hair can be in Black communities, or it could be skin tone as well. I think that there's just such a long and sordid history between photography and how Black history and Black stories have been told. And so stereotypes were really, really rampant in the past. thinking about like how Black men were always portrayed in images as criminal. If you searched for prisoner, it was typically a Black man. Or when you look for impoverished children or like poverty images, it's often, you know, young Black children, things like that. Nowadays, it's a lot less about what you do see and a lot more about what you don't see. The underrepresentation, I think, is actually where the stereotypes come through. And what I mean by that is nowadays, you'll always see angry or serious Black people most of the time in stock images, instead of Black men and women and boys and girls being joyful. You don't see a lot of images of people experiencing joy in many stock sites. And then you also see Black people who fit Eurocentric beauty standards most of the time, rather than the Afrocentric beauty that we value and that we love in our own communities. And you also don't see as many images of Black professionals in things like, you know, engineering or science or academics, advanced technology. Those stock photography images tend not to have as much diversity within them. So I guess not so much the stereotypes as much as what you fail to see represented nowadays. But what about you? Like from your experience, you created a whole organization based off a lack of representation. So I'm sure you saw many gaps.
There are, and the gaps is, as you said, in all sectors of our society. So, and we're welcoming any, you know, images, but as you said, the person, the person on the image is as important as the person taking the photo, I think. So, and that's why you get all these images that are not accurately representative of our communities, because they were not taken by people who lived in those communities. And it's important that we give space to the contributors and the creatives of those communities to reflect, you know, what's happening in where they live and within their families and with the people that they interact with every day. So I think that's the most important thing, like who is taking the photo? Because like I wouldn't be able to, I could try to represent like a Korean community, but there will be so many things that I will leave because I didn't grow up with them. I will be missing some of the traditions, some of the things that are unsaid, for example, things that people would assume are wrong. I will not probably be able to capture that. And I see it in the way people use images of Black people. We talk a lot about the Crown Act, where they were trying to pass that bill to allow people to wear their hair at work or at school the way they want. They could go with dreadlocks. But what's the problem with dreadlocks? There's no problem if you're a Black person or an Afrocentric person, right? There's a problem if you think that dreadlocks is associated with drugs and, you know, stuff like that. So that's your own issue. And if you're the one in charge of picking an image for your company, you will always avoid a person with dreadlocks because in your head, she or he will not be representative of your company, but it's actually false and untrue to assume that people with dreadlocks are having whatever lifestyle. So I see that as a problem. And that's why, you know, we're doing what we're doing. We are getting contributors from different places, and we can represent the communities beautifully and accurately.
Yes.
And I think I love that. It's a lot of work also for them to make them understand the mission also. I remember one day we had a challenge or something, and somebody submitted an image of a child in Africa, in the streets, smiling with underwear. And the title of that image was Kids Are the Future. And so I had to talk to that person and explain that he has, like, his work is really important. Like, he cannot just take photos of like kids in underwear. Like, and I was telling him, like, what if that child, like when he's 30 years old, he see himself like that? Do you think he's going to be happy to be maybe in a museum somewhere? I feel like you have to think about stuff like that. When you are photographing communities, you have a responsibility to depict your community in a good way, unless you're a photojournalist, and that's a different story. But if you do creative work, try to portray your community in a good light, because for too long, we've suffered from bad press and negativity in the media. So we need to overcome that. And we need to show that we do things like anybody else. I was at a show once a few years ago. It was in New York City, and I had a table and I had a few images that you can find on Pisha. And one guy came to me and he was very arrogant, and he was like, very like, oh, why are you saying that you are representing Africa, and this image is not Africa? And I looked at him and say, yes, that's in Africa. Like, what? Like, and I'm like, that's why I'm doing it, because of people like you who assume that there are such things in Africa, or there are not such things in Africa. So yes, like, we all have responsibility, because a lot of people, not all of them, but a lot of people come with assumptions, and they think they're right with their assumptions, which can be painful. But I guess that's life. That's the mission we have taken.
Well, but that's the thing. And I love your company's mission. If you don't mind, I'm really curious to know, in that situation, what was the image and what was the person so against in the image?
Because he thought I was lying.
Oh.
Yeah, he thought I was lying. So I was like, no, I'm not lying. So it was like it was an architectural image with a modern building.
Oh, okay.
And he assumed that you can find that in some places in Africa. And like, have you seen like the downtowns in many countries in Africa? There's buildings, there's, I mean, of course, there's different issues, but don't assume that there's always a lack of whatever you can find in your place. Because same thing, like I live in the United States, there's a lot of things that needs improvement here, like poverty, homelessness, stuff like that. So, and Americans don't portray that, you know. You will not see that on, that's not the first thing you will see on the stock platform or on a media company trying to portraying what is the United States. So we have to have that mindset as well, trying to portray something that's positive, because it's useful, and as you said, it changes perception, and it creates, there's a word that you used, you said normalize diversity. So
right.
It helps normalize us.
Exactly. Like we can't speak for that person who was there at that event, but there's a reason that they were so convinced that a building like that could not exist in Africa. And that's because all of the media we've consumed in North America about Africa and many other, like, Africa is such a diverse region of the world, but all these regions of the world outside of Canada and the US, the way that they've been portrayed in media for so long has been in such stark opposition to what we consider to be, what's the best word to use here? I don't agree with this word, but like civilized, you know?
Yes.
And so people have had decades upon decades of like conditioning through media around what, you know, different African communities actually look like, and how developed certain cities could potentially be. And this is why I think people often miss, or they underestimate, the power of media so often in shaping our perspective of the world, our perspectives of ourselves and the world. But it is so influential and so important, and that's why people like you and me are out here trying to break down and dismantle all those assumptions and stereotypes and misrepresentations that exist out there through various ways. It's really important to do, but it takes a long time for us to get there.
Yes, it does.
I just want to say I like that one point you made, though, in when people are thinking about imagery, it's important to ask yourself, because you were talking about the photographer earlier, who had the image of the kid, and ask yourself, would I like to be portrayed that way? Or would I like my loved ones to be portrayed that way? That's such an easy question to ask yourself, to see and to do just a check and balance as to whether the images that you're using could potentially be harmful.
That's so true. And I have to say that, and I always tell people, some people have asked me, like, how do I get educated on diversity and inclusion issues? And I always tell them, follow people who are experts who talk about it online on Twitter. There's a lot, like you are there. I have a few other friends on Twitter that I follow as well. And they've educated myself. Like, I get educated every time I read it. And since I've been following what they say, it also opened up my my thought about what you just said. Ask yourself, like, would you be happy if you were just walking in the street and somebody would just photograph you out of nowhere? And I see a lot of people do that in Africa. Like, they go to Africa, a woman is in the market, there's no question asked, and they take a photo and they put on Instagram. And I'm like, okay, maybe I wouldn't want that. Maybe we should ask the people. Obviously, I'm not talking about photojournalism work, that's different, but I feel like we have to think about stuff like that, like put ourselves in people's place. Because also people from diverse communities, like I myself, I'm a work in progress and I learn, try to get better on these issues, because as you said earlier, we have also biases of our own communities that we need to deconstruct. So it's only by listening to people like you who make great remarks on Twitter that actually we stop and start thinking about how it affects other people as well. So yeah.
Well, I appreciate that. You say that about me and others, but I'm a work in progress, just like you too. We all have our blind spots. I think that's what you have to be conscious of when we're doing work like this, and why it's so beneficial to have a diversity of perspectives around the table. Always ask yourself, like, who's missing from this table right now? And you'll usually end up with a much better outcome than if you just move along for the sake of time or whatever the case may be.
That's so true. I was reading recently, so the Census Bureau, they just said, wait, I'm just going to read it, otherwise I'm going to say it wrong. They had a report that revealed that the US population is much more multiracial than what was measured in the past. So recently, they've added a few questions on their census, and they've realized that actually people identify themselves as multiracial a lot more than they thought. And they say that compared to the previous report, it has changed considerably. So it was measured at 9 million people in 2010 who identified themselves as multiracial, to almost 34 million people in 2020. And the US population is what, 320 something million. So that's a lot. 34 million identify as multiracial. So I think this gives a good perspective on why it matters, why we have to think about that, and why we have to see it as a multi-layer initiatives or multi-layer policies, because people are not just one. They have different interactions with different cultures, and they are proud of it since they identify as it. So that was a great thing to see.
Yeah, it's encouraging to see these numbers rising, and it's encouraging that people are actually thinking about it more. Like, it's become part of the collective consciousness now, whereas before it didn't really.
Yes,
it existed, but it wasn't as recognized once upon a time. Now it's something we talk about so much more often.
That's true. And I'm sure the more we talk about it, the better it's going to be. Like, I think there was also a survey report that were saying that although brands were showing people of color, but they were only showing skin color, but they were not really representing people in color in their entire culture. So that was interesting also. Same, another point that was interesting is to see how, but that's not a report, that's an observation. Men tend to be picked for depiction of position of power. So usually on ads or on even social media ads or stuff like that, we see a lot more men being depicted in positions of power, while women are always doing domestic tasks, which needs to change, obviously. And obviously there's not a lot of representation when it comes to people living with some type of disability. I know it's hard, especially when it comes to invisible disability. But I think we should find a way to make it like a norm, like not make it like, oh, did you see that ad with a person on a wheelchair or whatever? Like, as you say, normalize things. And also, as you say, people want to belong. So I feel like people living with disability has had a really tough, I mean, they've pretty much had no representation in the media. So for them, it really means a lot when we try to, I mean, companies, advertising agencies try to add their voice, try to represent them a little bit more than they are. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of work to be done, but we have to keep talking about it.
Exactly. You were reminding me of something that I read about recently, and I don't want to be quoted on exactly what he won for, but I believe the artist here in Canada his name is Mustafa the Poet. And he won, there's basically like the Canadian Grammys, essentially. We have something called the Juno Awards here.
Yeah.
And he won, I believe, first Muslim rapper to win. And his acceptance speech was phenomenal to me, because what he said is, I don't want to be celebrated as the first. I don't think that that's something to be celebrated. I think that we need to start questioning why I'm the first, and stop celebrating being the first XYZ, and instead start examining why there's so many firsts still in 2022, essentially. And I loved that speech. I love that speech so much.
I agree. I hate hearing or reading about firsts. I'm like, what? I don't, as you said, as he said, we shouldn't be proud of it. Like,
exactly.
First of this, first of that. I'm like, what? Oh my God. And also, like we don't want to be like we wish that it was normalized for
It was the
everybody.
norm.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think it's hard when people from marginalized communities are saying like, we don't want to be celebrated as the first, and people who are part of more dominant culture look at us and they're like, why aren't you happy about that?
Yeah.
It's hard sometimes to have those conversations with people. It's like, we are happy. Yes, it's great. It's great news. We've seen some really great firsts. But it's like a double-edged sword, I guess.
It is.
Because you don't want to be hearing about the first Black Supreme Court judge. You don't want to be hearing
in 2022.
Yeah. So it's a hard conversation, but I think what Mustafa the poet was saying was really important for us to examine why there are still so many firsts today at this point in society. I think that will help people understand how much we like to think there's been just these mountains and mountains of progress, but rather it's been kind of these relatively like smaller steps, and a lot of it's just been put below the surface, whereas before a lot of it was a lot just way more overt in the past. The barriers that used to still exist, but the barriers that have existed for underrepresented folks still exist today. They're I think a little bit more hidden.
And I think the discussion also is difficult for us because especially when it happens in professional settings, because you could feel some type of way about something, but as we said, like, it's my experience. I'm a Black woman, but my experience will be different from another Black woman because, I live here in the US, but I was born in Gabon. I lived in France. I lived in the UK. I lived in different cities in the States. So I feel like every Black person is different, and we don't want the same thing for all of us. And we don't necessarily know what is best for us. Actually, we don't always know how to express it, pretty much. So that's why, as I was saying earlier, like, we need to add and think about all these layers of diversity and not be stuck in, I have a Black woman in this image. So as you said, I've ticked the box and I'm happy. Try to think about different stories that all these people can bring to your company, and stories and experiences. And we want to be seen as who we are with our multi-layers of experiences and ideas. And we don't want to be put in a box of, now you're a Black person and you're going to represent the entire community. That's a mistake also that a lot of companies do, like trying to take one person and that person will be the representative of the whole community, which is a lot to bear on. Like that's a big responsibility nobody wants to take.
No, I don't think anyone would want to be the expert on their entire community. But you're right, that does happen quite often. That is a big gap, a big misstep, I think, for organizations to take the perspective of one individual and apply that as fact, apply that as how to serve everybody based off one person's experience. You take a variety of experiences into consideration is your best. I think that's your best bet there. But it still happens. It still happens today.
That's great. So I think there's an issue with the streaming on LinkedIn. So I've recorded it, so I'm going to reshare it. So we're not going to have questions right now. So hopefully we get questions later when I post it. But I wanted to thank you for this conversation because it was really great. And I think you laid out great pointers about how to find, how to go about finding a best representative images for an ad, a company, a communication leaflet or something like that. So thank you so much. Thanks for attending Cafe Picha. That was our first one, and I'm really sorry that the link hasn't worked on LinkedIn, but I will repost the conversation. And I think my biggest takeout from this conversation is that we need to talk to a larger and diverse community when trying to find that right image, to make sure that we don't fall into stereotypes or tokenism, and we get to have a larger or more authentic representation of different communities. So that's my big take. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Maybe the one thing I'll add is, as a marketer, for me, the best marketing is based in storytelling. So when it comes to visual representation and marketing, what you want to do is just make sure that you're telling that story in an authentic way. And therefore, the images you use, the visuals you use will satisfy the elements of inclusion that you're trying to portray. That's what I would say.
That's great. That's great. Thank you so much. I will post it as soon as we're done. And I hope you have a great day and a great weekend, Dara. Thank you. You're amazing. And yeah, if you want to be educated on diversity and inclusion, you can follow there on Twitter, because you're often there, or on LinkedIn, because you share articles and you share your point of view on some of the current situations, which is great. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me, and congratulations on the first Cafe Picha on LinkedIn. I'm happy to have been included. One thing I'll say is, if you don't follow me on socials, if you go to dayraj.com, like my name, I actually have a whole guide on stock photography, which includes many sites that are outside of the traditional websites, that you can find really authentic and inclusive images that will represent the variety of diverse communities really well. I've put that together just because I think it's important. So
I will add it to the comment section.
Perfect. Okay.
All
it's
right.
so great to talk to you again, Josiane. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dara. I like how you pronounce it. Josiane, that's so nice.
Hopefully that's right.
Have a nice weekend.
Okay, you too. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.